Was Gene Simmons a lousy bass player? Let's talk about it. Can't think of very many bands off the top of my head that have as many accusations flying between the band members about the musical abilities of the other guys. In other words, Kiss, above all the bands I know of, cast the most dispersions on the other members' abilities to play. So you'll have Paul Stanley talking about how Peter Criss can't count to four, and Ace really could have been something, but drugs and alcohol reduced him to a subpar player. You'll have Gene Simmons talking about how Ace never really wanted to get the job done or concentrate on his songwriting, and how all Peter really did was sit around and complain. And I recently heard Ace say he spent most of his time in Kiss compensating on the rhythm guitar for Paul Stanley's poor playing. So there's a lot going on between the band members of the classic lineup so far as musicianship goes. But interestingly enough, I've never really heard any of the members of Kiss talk about Gene Simmons as a bass player or cast aspersions on his playing. But I have heard a lot of fans, and I've heard Gene himself cast aspersions on his playing. I saw him in an interview asked to rate his bass playing on a scale of 1 to 10, and he gave himself a 6, which I think is ridiculous. I think he is a much better bass player than people generally give him credit for. And I'm going to state just a couple of reasons why here real quick. First one is, when Kiss came out in the early 70s and established their sound, they were somewhere between Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, but Gene Simmons had a bass sound that wasn't anything like Geezer Butler's galloping style or anything like John Paul Jones's heavily bluesy style. His was much more darker, much more slappy, whippy, and it was a brooding sound down deep underneath the broiling mixture of the rest of Kiss, which is a pretty higher mid-range sound. So Peter Criss is one of those drummers that plays ahead of the beat, and of course back then he was pretty coked up, but the thing is he plays fast, and Gene is just this steady, rock solid. Even when you listen to a live performance from them in the 70s, he's able to keep pace with Peter without, sacrificing his own bass breath. He keeps the same phrasing, and he keeps the same general motivation. The other thing is, he's a very tuneful bass player, in the same way that Paul McCartney is a tuneful bass player. But Gene doesn't sound like Paul McCartney on bass, but he structures his bass parts so that they accentuate the tunefulness of Kiss songs, the hummability of them, which is something that Ace Frehley also does with his solos. This gives Kiss, particularly on an anthem like Rock and Roll All Night, or even a song like Love Gun, they just have this great hummable capacity that can be super loud but gets through to all listeners at just about the same frequency. And I think a lot of the reason that that's the case is because of Gene Simmons' bass pattern. It also shows a great deal of flexibility. He can go from something like God of Thunder, which is an almost Black Sabbath-y kind of stoner metal riff, to something like I Was Made for Loving You, which is clearly a disco song. And I mean, there's no real stammering in his transition from one mode to the other. My final point on his bass playing is that he's a really good live bass player. He has a good live tone. He's consistent. He's professional. He does hit a bad note here and there, but the thing is, he's leaping around and he's in a monster costume and he's breathing fire and he's spitting blood, and he's not in a band that, particularly in the 70s, while they were very well rehearsed in terms of their choreography and in terms of what was supposed to be happening musically. As I say, Peter Criss is not the most dependable. He's not a metronome. He is speeding up, slowing down, so Simmons has to compensate for that. So he's kind of a tough job. My last observation would be more like, why is it that people commonly assume that Gene Simmons is a subpar musician or his bass playing isn't special in any way? And I think it comes down to just a couple of things. First of all, if you're known for having a really long tongue and for being a sex addict and for breathing fire and for spitting blood on stage, your musicianship is naturally going to be an afterthought, even if you were Paganini. even if you're Hendrix on the bass, people are going to talk more about your stunts than your bass playing. The second reason, I think, is because his bass solos in the live performances are by design really dull and boring. They're just there to accentuate his blood spitting. So when he does have a chance to step into the spotlight, he just plays like a couple of growling low notes. And the third reason is because when he is singing, he adopts such a character and such a persona that people forget that he's also playing the bass line at the same time. So while Paul McCartney would get a lot of credit for like, oh look, he can sing and play bass at the same time, well, what a genius. Well, Gene Simmons does the same thing in any number of Kiss songs. So my feeling is Gene Simmons isn't a great bass player. He's not up in the ranks with, Geddy Lee or John Entwistle or Steve Harris or Billy Sheehan or anybody like that. But he's not a 6. I'm going to put him up, like an 8. I'm going to give him an 8. And the reason that I give him an 8, whereas 7 seems more logical, 8 is because he's compensating, as I pointed out, for Peter Criss, and not only that, Paul Stanley. Ace's criticisms of Paul Stanley are not completely off base. If you go back and listen to their live performances in the 70s, both Peter Criss and Paul Stanley are rather volatile and unpredictable from a purely musical point of view. Sometimes Paul Stanley's guitar is a little bit out of tune, he doesn't have a great live tone, and like I say, Peter Criss's meter is all over the place. That's part of what gives Kiss its character, and Gene Simmons' ability to race with Criss and slow down with Criss and wind around the roads with Peter Criss is part of what gives Kiss, particularly on their earlier albums, that interesting and unique character. This is what I think. If you ever thought about this or any other subject connected to classic or contemporary music, please comment in the section below, and remember to like and subscribe. Thanks a lot.